Now, with that, in this application, I'd like to add a new feature. Here, when I output these tasks, I'd like to add a link or a button above these tasks that allows me to change the order of these tasks, so that we either have the most recently added tasks at the top or that we have the oldest tasks at the top, so the tasks that have been added in the past. And to add this feature, we can go to this tasks component, and then there, above that unordered list, I'll simply add a paragraph with an anchor tag in it, where we say sort ascending or descending, depending on what we're currently doing. And we can then use router link to link to the page we're currently on by using this notation. That's another special syntax understood by Angular, which essentially tells Angular that you want to stay on the page where you are, or that you want to construct a path that starts at the current page. You could then add more to it, but here I'll just use it to stay on the page where I am. Because we can then also use another routing related feature. We can use query params for controlling the order of our tasks. Because of course, we could add a button here, and we could then connect this button to a click listener and use a signal to update our order. We could do that, but using query parameters has the advantage that we'll get a shareable link. Because query parameters are these extra pieces of information which you can add to your URL. They come after such a question mark, and you can then add any key value pairs of your choice here. And Angular's router gives you features that make it easy to add query parameters. But at the same time, the Angular router also helps you when it comes to extracting and using these query parameters. We can then therefore use this query parameter feature to dynamically recalculate, if you want to call it like this, our tasks, especially when we're using a signal, but even without that, as you will also see later. Now, in order to use the router link directive here, we must go to the tasks component, and there in the imports array, add router link, as we did it multiple times before. With that done, we can add the router link directive. And with that added, we can also add query params, which simplifies the process of adding query parameters to the URL this link will lead to. Now for that, query params, this input, actually wants an object, so we must use property binding here to pass an object to this input. And this object then allows you to define any key value pairs of your choice, and these will be the key value pairs that will be encoded as query parameters in the URL. So for example here, we could add a query parameter named order, though this name is entirely up to you, and set this to ASC. And with that, if you save that, you would have a link here, and we'll take care of styling in a second. And if you click that link, you see this order equals ASC query parameter was added here. If I go to a user that doesn't have any query parameters in the URL yet, and I click that link, you see this here was added. So that's working. Now to fix the styling real quick, we can go to the tasks component CSS file, and in there I'll add a very simple CSS rule which we can quickly write together, where we can target anchor elements in that component, set text decoration to none, and give them a color of hash C6A7ED. And of course, you can use any styling you want, but that will ensure that the link looks a bit nicer. And we can actually now also add a second rule here to make sure that if the link is hovered or active, we change the color by copying the color, and then I'll use the color picker in Visual Studio Code to pick a slightly darker shade. Yeah, so that looks better. But with that, we got this link that is setting the query parameter, but at the moment, it's always setting it to ASC. And that, of course, should be dynamic. It should be set to ASC if it's currently not set, or set to descending, and vice versa. And this text here also should be updated. And to do that, we need to get the current query parameter value. So that will be the next step. So setting query parameters is pretty straightforward. How can you now extract the currently active query parameters though? Well, in two main ways. If you got component input binding enabled, as we do in this demo app, you can simply add a new property to your component. A new property that has the name of your query parameter, for example, order. Order because that is the query parameter name I chose here. If you chose a different name, you'll need a different input name. And this is then an input which is not required here though, because it's absolutely possible that we don't have a query parameter. But if we got one, it will be a string that's either ASC or DESC. At least in my app here. These are the two kinds of values I want to set. So order then is a signal that contains a string that's either ASC or DESC or undefined, which it would be initially, for example. Now this input will now be set automatically by Angular, thanks to this setting here in our router configuration. And therefore in the template, we can now set the value of the query parameter when the user clicks the link dynamically depending on the current value of this query parameter. So we can now read that order input, which we just added, read that signal, and check if it's ASC for ascending. If that's the case, I want to set order to DESC. Otherwise, I'll set it to ASC. So if order is undefined or DESC, it will be set to ASC. If it is set to ASC, it will be set to DESC. So that should make sure that this link attaches different query parameters depending on what we currently have. And therefore the text here should also change dynamically. Here I can use string interpolation to read my order and check if it's ascending, in which case I want to output sort descending, so I want to output the text descending here, otherwise the text ascending. So that overall the text changes as this query parameter value changes. With that, if we reload, here for example, you can see that it says sort ascending at the beginning, and if I click this query parameter with a value of ASC was added, and this text here now changed. If I now click it, this query parameter value also changed to DESC. So that's working the way it should, thanks to this automatic input binding. But as mentioned, that's just one way of getting hold of that query parameter value. So how else can you get access to that query parameter value that might be set? Well, essentially by using the same approach we used before as an alternative to getting the route parameter. If you're not relying on input binding, you can use this activated route object and set up a subscription to be notified about changes. So here we can add a new private property, for example, called activated route. And we inject the activated route object for that. And then, for example, in ng on init, and hence I'll implement the on init interface so that I'm forced to add ng on init. In there, we can use this activated route, and then there, not use the param map, but instead the query params observable here. And then we can subscribe here to be notified about changes to these params. So we can use that observer object here, and we'll get this params information, so this params object automatically as an input to this next function then. And in there we can then use this information. So instead of using this order input binding, we could then add an order property, which initially might be undefined, but which eventually should be a string that's either ASC or DESC. And here in this function, we can set this order equal to params, and then access this order key in there. So this item with a name of order. And that name here is of course the name of the query parameter you want to extract. And since we have a subscription, this will be updated whenever the query parameters change. Now, since we have a subscription, we should also clean it up, as always. That is always a good idea. So I'll inject destroy ref and then use it to register this cleanup hook here. And then we can simply store this subscription here in a constant or variable and unsubscribe here in this cleanup hook. But this here is the important part. With that, this order property is set automatically and reactively. And now we just need to change it here in the template since it's no longer a signal. But with those changes made, if you save everything, you should have the same behavior as before. If you go to a user, there is no query parameter information in the URL initially. So it says sort ascending. If you click it, that's added here. And you can see that the text changed. And if you click it again, the query parameter changed here. So that's now also working, but now without using this input binding feature, instead by using the query params observable on this activated route.